The morning an entire neighborhood realized they had been driving across my land for years. Nobody believed the man holding the lock. The first sound was not shouting. It was the sharp metallic click of a heavy padlock closing around a weathered steel chain stretched across the narrow bridge that crossed the river, separating my ranch from Cedar Ridge Estates. The air smelled like damp cedar, fresh grass, and cool water drifting beneath the old steel beams as the first rays of sunrise painted everything in soft gold. I slipped the old brass key into my jacket pocket, rested a thick folder of certified property records against the tailgate of my pickup truck, and quietly waited. It took less than 5 minutes for the first vehicle to appear. A white pickup slowed to a stop, its driver lowering the window with a confused expression before reading the professionally printed notice hanging from the chain. He looked at me, looked back at the bridge, then slowly reversed without saying a word. That silence lasted only a few more minutes. Soon another truck arrived, followed by 2 sport utility vehicles, a delivery van, a landscaping trailer, and a line of commuters stretching farther down the road with every passing minute. Brake lights reflected across the morning mist while puzzled conversations floated through open windows. Some drivers stepped outside to read the notice themselves. Others stared at the chain as though it had appeared from nowhere overnight. I remained exactly where I was, leaning against my truck with both hands folded, saying nothing because there was nothing left to explain until the right people arrived. They did not keep me waiting long. A black luxury sport utility vehicle rolled to the front of the growing line before stopping abruptly. The driver's door opened with practiced confidence, and out stepped the president of the Homeowners Association. Victoria Harrison wore the same tailored navy blazer and composed smile she always seemed to carry into every disagreement, the kind of smile that assumed every problem could be solved simply by reminding everyone who she believed was in charge. She walked toward me without looking at the notice. "You need to remove this immediately," she said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "You cannot block access to an entire community." I met her eyes, reached into my folder, and held out a certified copy of a recorded property deed without taking a single step forward. She barely glanced at the document before pushing it back toward me. "Our attorneys will deal with whatever paperwork you think you found," she replied. "Move the chain." Before I could answer, flashing lights appeared at the far end of the road. 2 sheriff's patrol vehicles slowly approached through the line of waiting traffic, their tires crunching across loose gravel before stopping near the bridge. The deputies greeted both of us professionally before asking what had happened. Victoria spoke first, confidently explaining that I had illegally blocked the neighborhood entrance. I said very little. Instead, I handed the senior deputy the same organized folder containing certified deeds, county surveys, engineering reports, title records, and a formal legal notice prepared by my attorney. He accepted the documents without comment, walked a few steps away from the crowd, and carefully reviewed each page while the only sounds came from the flowing river below, idling engines, and birds waking in the cottonwood trees. Every minute felt longer than the last. Residents whispered among themselves. Victoria folded her arms, completely certain the deputies would order me to remove the chain within moments. Then the deputy closed the folder, looked directly at me, nodded once, and turned toward the growing crowd. His calm expression told me everything before he even spoke. That was the exact moment an entire neighborhood began discovering that the bridge they believed belonged to their community had always belonged to my family. And the truth behind that impossible morning had actually begun decades before I ever locked a single chain across the road. The deputy's words pulled me backward through time long before that chain ever touched the bridge. Everything really began 6 months earlier, on a quiet afternoon when I stood alone outside my grandfather's weathered ranch house holding the envelope that officially transferred 1,200 acres into my name. The wind carried the familiar scent of fresh hay, cedar trees, and river water across the rolling fields where I had spent countless summers as a child. Nothing about the landscape had changed. The old red barn still leaned slightly toward the west after decades of storms. The gravel driveway still curved beneath towering oak trees before reaching the farmhouse porch. Even the steel bridge crossing the river looked exactly as I remembered, worn by time, but standing with the same quiet strength it had always carried. My grandfather believed that if something was built correctly the first time, It deserved respect instead of replacement. I understood those words much better after he was gone. Although I had built a successful career as a civil engineer in another state, returning home never felt like starting over. It felt like returning to a promise I had made years earlier. I intended to restore the ranch, improve the irrigation system, repair aging fences, and protect the land that had remained in our family for generations. During the first few weeks, I focused on ordinary work. Every morning began before sunrise with a cup of black coffee on the porch while mist drifted across the river. I walked fence lines, inspected old equipment, met neighboring ranchers, and slowly learned every corner of the property again. Life moved at the steady pace I remembered from childhood, and I found comfort in that rhythm. One evening, while organizing my grandfather's workshop, I noticed something that had escaped my attention for years. Hanging from a small wooden peg beside his old drafting table was a polished brass key attached to a faded leather tag. In my grandfather's careful handwriting were only 5 simple words. "Keep this. They will forget." There was no explanation, no map, no additional note, just those words. I slipped the key into my pocket, assuming it opened an old cabinet or storage locker somewhere on the ranch. At the time, I had no reason to think it meant anything more. A few days later, I drove toward town for building supplies and crossed the same steel bridge I had crossed hundreds of times throughout my life. As I reached the other side, I noticed a large stone entrance welcoming residents to Cedar Ridge Estates. Beautiful homes stretched across the hillside beyond carefully landscaped medians, decorative fencing, flowering trees, and quiet suburban streets. It looked like a community that had existed forever, yet I remembered when those fields had still belonged to neighboring ranches. Progress had slowly replaced open pasture while I was building my career elsewhere. I smiled, wishing the families well, never imagining that almost every vehicle entering that neighborhood crossed a bridge my grandfather had quietly maintained for decades. At that moment, the brass key resting in my jacket pocket felt like nothing more than a keepsake from a man who loved preparing for every possibility. I could not have imagined that within a matter of weeks the same neighborhood would introduce me to a homeowners association convinced it held authority over land that had never stopped belonging to my family, or that my grandfather had already anticipated exactly what would happen long before I inherited a single acre. My first meeting with the homeowners association happened because of a simple envelope tucked inside my mailbox. At first, I assumed it was another welcome letter from the county or a utility company updating service information for the ranch. Instead, I unfolded a neatly printed notice informing me that my property contained several violations requiring immediate correction. I read every line twice, convinced it had been delivered to the wrong address. According to the letter, I needed approval before replacing sections of my fence visible from the community entrance. My weathered ranch sign did not comply with neighborhood appearance standards, and my no trespassing signs created an unfriendly visual impression that negatively affected surrounding property values. I actually laughed out loud standing there beside my mailbox because none of it made any sense. My ranch had existed for generations before Cedar Ridge Estates was ever built. Still, I believed the situation could be resolved with one polite conversation. The following afternoon, I drove into the neighborhood and parked outside the beautifully maintained clubhouse surrounded by flowering shrubs, trimmed hedges, and perfectly edged sidewalks. Inside, the lobby smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished wood. Framed photographs of neighborhood events lined the walls beside awards celebrating community beautification. A receptionist greeted me warmly before leading me into a conference room where Victoria Harrison was already waiting. She stood as I entered, extended a professional handshake, and welcomed me with a confident smile that felt practiced after years of leading meetings. At first, our conversation remained courteous. I explained that I had recently inherited the ranch and believed the notice had been sent in error because my property was not part of Cedar Ridge Estates. Victoria listened patiently before opening a large binder filled with community maps and architectural guidelines. She slid one page toward me and calmly explained that the entrance corridor created a shared visual environment, meaning surrounding property owners were expected to cooperate with neighborhood standards. I politely pointed out that my ranch predated the subdivision by decades and had never joined the homeowners association. Her smile barely changed. She replied that while paperwork could sometimes become outdated, cooperation benefited everyone. Before leaving, she casually mentioned that the association planned future improvements near the bridge entrance, including landscaping, decorative lighting, and upgraded signage. The comment caught my attention because she spoke about the bridge as though it belonged to the neighborhood instead of the surrounding ranch land. I asked who owned the structure. She answered without hesitation that the entrance had always served Cedar Ridge Estates, and therefore functionally belonged to the community. Something about the certainty in her voice stayed with me during the drive home. Over the following days, more letters arrived. One requested permission for contractors to improve vegetation near the entrance. Another reminded me that exterior modifications should receive prior approval. Then I noticed unfamiliar utility flags planted near the edge of my pasture and survey crews taking measurements close to the bridge. Every encounter remained polite. No one threatened me. No one raised their voice. Yet each small event carried the same quiet assumption that someone else possessed authority over land my grandfather had carefully protected his entire life. As I stood beside the old steel bridge watching workers pack their equipment into white utility trucks, I slipped my hand into my jacket pocket and felt the smooth brass key resting exactly where I had left it. For reasons I still could not explain, my grandfather's 5 handwritten words echoed through my mind more clearly than ever before. They will forget. The survey flags multiplied almost overnight. Bright orange markers appeared along the edge of my pasture. Thin wooden stakes stood beside the gravel road leading toward the bridge, and small patches of fluorescent paint dotted the ground where my grandfather had always insisted every property line was exactly where the original survey placed it. Every morning I found something new. One day it was a surveying tripod overlooking the river. The next, it was a contractor measuring the shoulder of the road while comparing notes on a tablet. None of the workers behaved rudely. Whenever I introduced myself, they answered politely and explained they had been hired to prepare improvements requested by the homeowners association. Most believed they were working inside community property because that was what their project documents showed. Instead of arguing with them, I thanked them for their time and quietly wrote down company names, dates, and locations in a small notebook I carried in my truck. My years as an engineer had taught me that facts collected calmly usually carried far more weight than opinions expressed emotionally. A week later, another certified letter arrived. This one informed me that landscaping work near the entrance corridor would begin soon and asked me to avoid interfering with scheduled improvements. The wording immediately caught my attention because it referred to areas that I had always believed were part of my ranch. I drove to the county records office hoping to clear up what I assumed was a simple mapping error. The clerk behind the counter helped me locate recent filings connected to Cedar Ridge Estates. Most documents were completely ordinary, including maintenance agreements, utility easements, and road improvement permits. Nothing directly transferred ownership of any part of my ranch. Even so, one attached site plan showed decorative upgrades extending suspiciously close to the bridge. I requested copies before returning home with more questions than answers. 2 mornings later, I heard diesel engines outside before sunrise. Looking across the pasture, I saw several contractor trucks parked near the bridge while crews unloaded equipment for preliminary work. Temporary barriers, measuring wheels, and stacks of landscape materials sat beside the road as supervisors reviewed printed plans. I walked over with a friendly wave and introduced myself again. The project manager greeted me respectfully and showed me the work order authorizing entrance enhancements approved by the homeowners association. His paperwork included diagrams, schedules, and contractor signatures, but when I asked whether anyone had verified ownership of the bridge corridor itself, he paused for the first time. He admitted that property verification normally came from the client and recommended I discuss the matter directly with the association before construction advanced further. That afternoon, I called Victoria Harrison and explained what I had learned. She remained perfectly composed. She assured me the association had managed the entrance area for years and believed everything was properly documented. She even suggested that decades of uninterrupted maintenance demonstrated community responsibility regardless of old records. Her confidence was remarkable, yet she never actually identified a recorded deed placing the bridge under the association's ownership. After ending the call, I stood alone beside the steel railing watching the river move steadily beneath the bridge. The late afternoon sunlight reflected across the water while the familiar scent of cedar drifted through the warm air. I reached into my pocket, wrapped my fingers around my grandfather's polished brass key, and realized something important. Nobody I had spoken with seemed interested in proving who owned the bridge. They simply assumed they already knew. At that moment, I stopped trying to convince anyone that a mistake had been made. Instead, I decided it was finally time to discover exactly why my grandfather believed one small key would matter so many years after he wrote those 5 unforgettable words. The next morning, I drove to the county sheriff's office carrying a folder filled with every letter the homeowners association had mailed during the previous month. I was not asking anyone to arrest anybody or force a decision. I simply wanted to understand where the law stood before the situation grew more complicated. The deputy at the front desk listened patiently while I explained the survey crews, the contractor activity near the bridge, and the conflicting claims about who controlled the entrance corridor. After reviewing the documents, he handed the folder back with a respectful nod. He explained that based on everything I had described, the disagreement appeared to involve competing claims of property rights rather than criminal activity. Unless someone ignored a court order or intentionally entered clearly restricted property after ownership had been legally established, the sheriff's office could not decide who owned the land. It was a civil matter that would have to be resolved through property records, title research, or the courts if necessary. His answer was professional, fair, and exactly what I needed to hear. As I walked back to my truck, I realized something important. Nobody was coming to solve this problem for me. If I wanted the truth, I would have to prove it one document at a time. That afternoon, I scheduled a meeting with a local real estate attorney named Daniel Mercer, a man whose family had practiced property law in the county for decades. His office overlooked the courthouse square, filled with shelves of legal books, framed survey maps, and historical photographs of the county stretching back more than a century. He carefully examined every notice, every map, and every copy of the county filings I had collected. When I finished explaining everything that had happened, he leaned back in his chair for several quiet seconds before speaking. He did not tell me that the homeowners association was right. He also did not immediately tell me that I was right. Instead, he asked one simple question. Do you have your grandfather's original property records? I admitted that I had inherited boxes of documents, but had not examined all of them because I assumed the recorded deed was enough. Daniel smiled slightly and said that assumptions had created more property disputes than almost anything else. Original surveys, easement agreements, bridge maintenance records, engineering drawings, and title documents often revealed details that newer copies overlooked. As soon as I returned to the ranch, I walked directly into my grandfather's workshop. The familiar scent of machine oil, aged pine lumber, and worn leather surrounded me as afternoon sunlight filtered through dusty windows. Every tool remained exactly where he had left it, as though he had only stepped outside for a few minutes. My eyes settled on the small wooden peg where the polished brass key had hung for years before I slipped it into my pocket. I held it in my hand, studying the worn edges that countless years of use had polished smooth. This time I did not assume it belonged to an ordinary cabinet. I searched the workshop slowly, opening drawers, checking shelves, and examining old workbenches until I noticed a heavy steel storage cabinet built into the far wall behind stacks of neatly labeled wooden crates. The cabinet had no visible handle, only a circular brass lock that looked almost identical in color and age to the key resting in my palm. For a long moment, I simply stood there listening to the quiet ticking of an old wall clock while my grandfather's handwritten message echoed once again inside my mind. Keep this. They will forget. I slid the brass key into the lock, turned it carefully, and heard a solid mechanical click that sounded as though it had been waiting decades for someone to open the door. The cabinet door opened with surprising ease, releasing the faint smell of aged paper, cedar wood, and machine oil that had been sealed away for decades. Inside were dozens of neatly organized binders, rolled survey maps tied with cotton ribbon, leather folders labeled in my grandfather's careful handwriting, and several metal document boxes arranged with almost military precision. Nothing had been thrown together. Every record had its place. I carried the first stack to the large workbench beneath the window where afternoon sunlight spilled across the worn oak surface. Hours passed without my noticing. I carefully unfolded yellowed engineering drawings of the ranch, original boundary surveys dating back generations, bridge maintenance logs, correspondence with county engineers, and title documents preserved inside protective sleeves. My grandfather had documented everything. Every inspection, every repair, every tax payment, every survey revision, every permit application, and every recorded filing had been copied, dated, and indexed. The deeper I searched, the more one pattern became impossible to ignore. Every official document consistently identified the steel bridge as part of the ranch property rather than any neighboring subdivision. Near the bottom of one storage box, I discovered a sealed envelope marked only with the words "Bridge Records." My heartbeat quickened as I carefully opened it. Inside rested the original recorded deed describing the bridge parcel in remarkable detail, accompanied by certified copies bearing county recording stamps from decades earlier. Attached behind the deed was an easement agreement allowing neighboring agricultural properties to cross the bridge under specific conditions long before Cedar Ridge Estates existed. I read every page slowly, making certain I understood each sentence. Then I reached the final page. The easement had a clearly defined expiration clause connected to changes in land ownership and future development. According to the recorded language, once those surrounding ranch properties were permanently subdivided and alternative legal arrangements became necessary, the original easement no longer remained in effect unless a new agreement had been negotiated with the bridge owner. I stopped reading and simply stared at the page. Cedar Ridge Estates had been built years after that document was signed, yet nowhere inside the cabinet could I find any replacement easement granting permanent access to the subdivision. I immediately called Daniel Mercer and asked if I could bring everything to his office the following morning. He agreed without hesitation. The next day, we spent several hours reviewing each document together. Daniel examined recording numbers, compared legal descriptions with county plats, and checked every signature against official indexes. His careful expression gradually shifted from professional curiosity to quiet confidence. He explained that the documents appeared exceptionally well preserved and internally consistent. Even so, he recommended verifying everything through independent sources before taking any action. Within days, he coordinated a licensed surveyor to confirm current property boundaries, while a title company began tracing the complete ownership history of the bridge corridor. Neither investigation relied on my grandfather's files alone. Instead, both compared those records against official county archives. As the reports slowly returned, every independent finding pointed toward the same conclusion. The surveyed boundaries matched the original drawings almost perfectly, and the chain of title consistently showed the bridge parcel remaining with my family's ranch through every recorded transfer. I felt no excitement, only a growing sense of responsibility. Facts like these demanded patience rather than celebration. I carefully returned every original document to protective folders, placed the brass key beside them on the workbench, and understood exactly why my grandfather had never relied on memories, assumptions, or neighborhood tradition. He had preserved evidence because he knew that one day the truth would need documents instead of opinions. Daniel Mercer reminded me of something that became the foundation of everything that followed. He said that having the truth and proving the truth were two completely different things. The original records were extraordinary, but he wanted every important fact, supported by modern documentation that nobody could dismiss as outdated or incomplete. During the following 2 weeks, I resisted every temptation to confront the homeowners association. Instead, I focused entirely on preparation. A licensed surveyor returned to the ranch with advanced equipment and carefully verified every boundary marker shown on the original plats. I walked beside the crew through open pastures, along fence lines, and across the old steel bridge while they compared historical coordinates with current measurements. Their final report confirmed that the bridge corridor remained entirely within the legal boundaries of my family's ranch. Next came a structural engineering inspection. Although I already knew the bridge was safe because my grandfather had maintained it with remarkable care, Daniel wanted an independent report documenting its condition before any future dispute could arise. The engineer spent an entire day examining support beams, decking, drainage, and load capacity before issuing a detailed written assessment confirming that the structure remained sound and had clearly received consistent long-term maintenance. That finding quietly reinforced something else. If the homeowners association believed it owned the bridge, there was no record showing it had actually maintained it. Every repair invoice preserved inside my grandfather's cabinet had been paid by my family. The title company completed its investigation a few days later. Their chain of title traced ownership across decades without identifying a single recorded transfer, placing the bridge parcel into the hands of Cedar Ridge Estates, or the Homeowners Association. Daniel carefully assembled every report into a single organized binder with certified copies stored separately. He insisted that every page be labeled, indexed, and easy to follow because clarity often carried as much weight as the evidence itself. Once everything had been verified, he prepared a formal legal notice addressed to the Homeowners Association. The letter respectfully explained the documented ownership history of the bridge, included references to the recorded deed, summarized the survey and title findings, and requested that no further work be performed on the bridge corridor without my written permission. It also explained that any continued use of the bridge should be addressed through proper legal discussion rather than assumption. The notice was delivered by certified mail, and we retained proof of delivery. Then we waited. Days passed quietly. No response arrived. Instead, contractor vehicles continued appearing near the entrance from time to time, and residents crossed the bridge exactly as they always had. Nothing changed. Daniel smiled when I mentioned my frustration. He reminded me that silence after receiving formal notice could become just as important as any written reply. While we waited, I installed several security cameras overlooking the bridge and surrounding roadway. They were not there to provoke anyone. They simply created an accurate record of activity should questions arise later. Every evening I reviewed the footage while sitting on the farmhouse porch listening to crickets, tree frogs, and the steady flow of the river beneath the bridge. The polished brass key rested on the small table beside my coffee cup, catching the warm light from the porch lamp as the sun disappeared beyond the western hills. My grandfather had prepared for this moment decades earlier without ever knowing my name would eventually appear on the deed. I finally understood what he had truly left me. It was not merely land, a bridge, or a collection of old documents. He had left me the patience to let evidence speak before I ever needed to raise my own voice. And when the legal notice period finally expired without any meaningful response, Daniel quietly told me that the next decision belonged entirely to me. Before sunrise on the morning the notice period expired, I drove my pickup to the entrance carrying only 3 things that mattered: the heavy steel chain, the weathered brass key that had started this journey, and the binder containing every certified document Daniel had carefully assembled. The air was cool enough that a light mist drifted across the river beneath the bridge, and the only sounds came from birds waking in the cottonwood trees and the gentle current moving below the steel beams my grandfather had spent decades maintaining. I parked beside the bridge, stepped onto the gravel shoulder, and quietly fastened the chain across the entrance. I attached a professionally printed notice explaining that access across the privately owned bridge had been suspended pending resolution of documented property rights, and that all inquiries should be directed to the attorney listed at the bottom of the page. There were no dramatic gestures and no raised voices. Everything happened exactly as the law allowed. Then I waited. The first commuter arrived only minutes later, slowing to read the notice before turning around with a puzzled expression. More vehicles followed until a long line formed along the road. Most drivers remained surprisingly patient. Some stepped out to read the notice more closely while others made phone calls, trying to understand why the familiar morning routine had suddenly changed. I answered only the questions I could answer with certainty. When someone politely asked whether this was really my bridge, I simply replied that every question would be addressed through the legal documents available for review. Not long afterward, Victoria Harrison's black sport utility vehicle pulled to the front of the growing line. She stepped out quickly, looked at the chain, then at me, her expression shifting from confusion to complete disbelief. She demanded that I remove the barrier immediately and insisted that I was interfering with community access. I calmly handed her another copy of the legal notice together with Daniel's business card. She barely glanced at either before announcing that she had already contacted the sheriff's office. I nodded and returned to leaning against my truck. Within several minutes, 2 sheriff's patrol vehicles arrived, their emergency lights flashing only to safely manage traffic. The same senior deputy who had reviewed my documents earlier greeted both of us with quiet professionalism. Victoria immediately explained that I had blocked the entrance used daily by hundreds of residents. The deputy listened without interruption before asking whether I still possessed the supporting documentation I had previously provided. I handed him the organized binder. He carefully reviewed the certified deed, the title report, the independent survey, the engineering inspection, proof of the expired easement, and the certified delivery confirming that formal legal notice had been received weeks earlier. Several residents watched silently from nearby sidewalks while others waited beside their vehicles. The only sounds came from idling engines, birds overhead, and pages turning inside the deputy's hands. After several long minutes, he closed the binder, looked first at Victoria and then at the waiting crowd. His voice remained calm, respectful, and completely free of emotion as he explained that the records presented identified the bridge as private property and that the sheriff's office had no authority to order the owner to reopen it because the matter involved documented civil property rights rather than criminal conduct. He encouraged both parties to continue resolving the disagreement through their attorneys and the appropriate legal process. An almost unbelievable silence settled across the entrance. Residents slowly looked from the bridge to Victoria, then toward me, realizing that the assumptions guiding their community for years had collided with documented facts preserved long before any of them ever moved into Cedar Ridge Estates. In that quiet moment, nobody argued anymore because every important answer now rested inside the binder sitting on the hood of my truck rather than in anyone's opinion. The conversations that followed did not happen in a single afternoon. They unfolded over several weeks inside conference rooms, attorney offices, and county record buildings where every statement had to be supported by evidence instead of assumptions. After reviewing the complete title history, the Homeowners Association retained a new real estate attorney who requested copies of every survey, engineering report, and recorded document my attorney had assembled. Daniel Mercer welcomed the review because he believed that independent verification would remove any remaining doubt. One by one, each document was examined against county archives, historical plats, tax records, and recorded deeds. Every source pointed to the same conclusion. My family had never transferred ownership of the bridge or the narrow corridor beneath it. The original easement had expired exactly as the recorded agreement described, and no permanent replacement had ever been negotiated. For the first time since I inherited the ranch, nobody questioned the facts. The only remaining discussion centered on how everyone could move forward. I had never wanted to isolate an entire neighborhood or create unnecessary hardship for families who had simply trusted what they had been told for years. My disagreement had never been with the residents. It had always been with the assumption that ownership could quietly change without documentation. Because of that, I instructed Daniel to prepare a proposal instead of a demand. I offered a permanent recorded access easement allowing Cedar Ridge Estates to continue using the bridge exactly as before, provided the agreement formally recognized my ownership, established shared maintenance responsibilities, protected my surrounding ranch operations, and ensured that any future improvements required written approval from both parties. The proposal was reviewed carefully before being accepted with only minor revisions. Once the final documents were signed and recorded with the county, I unlocked the chain and watched the first vehicles cross the bridge under an agreement supported by clear legal records instead of uncertain tradition. The atmosphere felt completely different from the morning the bridge had been closed. Drivers slowed to wave as they crossed. Several residents stopped over the following days simply to introduce themselves and thank me for finding a solution that protected everyone's interests. Even Victoria Harrison changed. During one final meeting, she acknowledged that the association had relied on long-standing assumptions instead of verifying the original property records. She later stepped down as president, and the community elected new leadership committed to reviewing historical documents before making future decisions affecting neighboring landowners. Life gradually returned to its familiar rhythm. I repaired fences, managed irrigation projects, and continued restoring the ranch exactly as I had planned when I first came home. The steel bridge remained where it had always stood, carrying neighbors across the river each day, but now every crossing rested upon an agreement built on respect rather than misunderstanding. Back inside my grandfather's workshop, I placed the polished brass key inside the same steel cabinet where I had found it months earlier. Beside it rested the original deed, the updated recorded easement, and the complete binder documenting everything that had happened. As I closed the cabinet door, I finally understood the full meaning of my grandfather's handwritten message. He never expected me to win through anger, louder arguments, or public confrontation. He expected me to protect the truth with patience, preparation, and evidence because people may forget history, traditions may become confused, and assumptions may spread from one generation to the next. But carefully preserved facts have a remarkable way of bringing justice back to exactly where it belongs.